Welcome back to the show, everyone. We're not laughing, Dana. We were.
Wait, what? I have to look. For those that are only listening, I tried to make my face as droopy as possible to not belie my laughing seconds prior.
Seconds prior.
Yeah,
Seconds
yeah.
prior.
Yeah.
Okay, Dana, I'm gonna let you launch us on this one.
Oh yeah, so this one, those light speed brains out there that also have excellent pattern recognition and could take from A to Z. If you had to explain something being related, you could do it, right? And it might be a really arduous route to get there, but you'll figure out how two things can relate in your mind to have it make sense. And I think that we've learned to do this growing up because there's so many things we didn't understand that we had to try to make them make sense. And so we can put two things together to have them make sense really well. So I want to use an example that's not mine, but it's Hannah Gatsby is a stand-up comic. She's been diagnosed autistic, this really funny Australian lady. I don't recommend watching her first Netflix special called Nanette because even she says it's just this massive trauma dump and it's kind of traumatizing. Don't watch that one. The one that's called Douglas, that is her show named after her dog Douglas, is a beautiful representation. The whole show is a beautiful representation of how the autistic mind works and how she does it. And then this one story she tells when she was the education system is different in Australia, but I imagine it was around like when she's 7 or 8ish, second, third grade, somewhere in there. And the teacher is teaching them about prepositions. And the teacher gives an example for how to learn. She's okay, imagine a box. And she'll tell the story. And she's like, okay, a box. Great visual learner. I've got a picture of a box. It's all flushed out. I know exactly what it looks like. And then the teacher says, we're going to talk about your relationship to the box. And she says, that's when it goes downhill because she says, are you, and then she raises her hand before the teacher can go on. And she says, am I made of box? And in her mind, she was wondering the relationship, right? Like, am I related to you, Gwen? Do we share DNA? She's thinking along the lines of an 8-year-old's, am I related to the box? So she says, am I made of box to the teacher? And the teacher looks at her, no, what? No, you're not made of box. Okay. So she's like, all right. So she says, imagine you're standing next to the box. What is the preposition in that? And then she says, no one says anything, but I have questions. So then she keeps asking these questions that, as she's describing what's going on in her mind, make perfect sense, right? She's wanting to know the relationship. She's wanting to know if box is inside me. She's wanting to know if there's, particles of box, me in the box. And then the teacher shifts frequencies and says, okay, let's say there's a penguin in the box. Well, you can imagine the penguin being introduced to the scenario. So she talks about how the teacher is sort of tolerating these seemingly completely off the deep end questions. And then when she introduces the penguin, that's when the irritation, she says, my teacher who would never swear, swears. Like, why would you effing think that, right? And she's describing, it's funny the way she describes it, but it really is, it's so true because in her mind, she is making that make sense. Am I made of box? My relationship to the box. And what obviously preposition, the teacher's saying like your juxtaposition, are you next to,
Right.
are you on top of?
Right.
But in her 8-year-old mind, because she doesn't know what prepositions are yet, she's being taught this. It's just, I am the box, right? And it's such a perfect example of one brain. It absolutely makes sense what they're trying to do, draw these connections, and can. Maybe a non-autistic brain would never have thought of something like, I'm related to the box. Am I made of box? The other kids are probably like, I don't understand what's going on. But to the teacher and the other kids, that didn't, those associations aren't there at all, right? So I'll do this a lot of times with my wife. I'll just blurt out something that I've made 6 steps to connect.
Yeah.
And she's like, and then I'll sort of laugh and say, oh, there's my autistic brain. And I'll say this, show her what I was thinking to get there.
Hmm.
And then she'll say, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense, right? But that is really a proverbial thing that happens in terms of disconnect between a neurodivergent brain and neurotypical brains all the time, making those connections. I had a client once say that she got the wrong drink at Starbucks because someone, let me use an example. This wasn't the example, but let's say it's something like I tell them my name's Dana, and then it's a coffee for Dan, right? And I, in my mind, within seconds could think, well, it's about the size of the one I ordered. Maybe it's my latte. Maybe they just didn't pronounce the A. My dad's wife, who was from England, used to say "daner" was a form of dropping that last syllable. It's probably my drink. I've been here for a while. No one else is going to get the drink. I go get the drink. This is what happened to her with a different name. Walks out. As she's walking out, someone says, "Excuse me, I think you had my drink." In her mind, it made perfect sense of all the things that were in the environment, made up the story, if you will, to have it make sense. Especially since no one else was going to grab the drink, it made perfect sense, right?
Yeah.
And you describe that to someone who isn't in that brain, and they look at you like you're crazy. Like,
Hmm.
what is going on? Can you imagine what it's like to be in early learning scenarios like that, right? The interference your own brain would have in trying to grapple with something and try to make connections between things. Uh, but then also, if you have someone in your life, my mom loved, in hindsight, we didn't know what was going on, but she loved my mind. I'd use that example of how I did that to see what it was like to be a Kleenex in a box. And she would say, how did you think of that? That's how I thought of that. It's that mindset of like what's in here and how can I make point A to get to point Z when they really aren't associated in real life, but I can make them be associated, right? I do this all the times with songs that I'm learning for the first time. I'll have the words totally wrong because in my mind the associations completely made sense. And then you read what the real lyric is, and you just have to kind of laugh at yourself.
As you've been belting it out, and now you can't think
Yeah, you can't stop it.
of an
Yeah,
alternative.
exactly. Yep.
I think like this kind of speaks to the power of the mind. And in many ways, like the mind is there for making meaning,
Mhm, mhm.
right? It's not there to learn like weird facts. Well, it is if it's related to meaning of something else.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's really not there. And this is why I think a lot of times, tasks, calendaring, these types of things, this is
Mhm.
what people lose all the time. There's no kind of
Yeah,
like, but if you put it within a system in order to capture it,
yeah.
but I
But then you
really
have to
feel
make
like,
sure you learn the system. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I really feel like the mind is always trying to make meaning of things. And
Yeah.
when you've got when the flow is high,
Mhm,
meaning
mhm.
there's a big load and frequency of thoughts.
Yeah.
How do you connect these? It's not unusual for me when a client comes into session and they start somewhere and I'm like,
Mhm.
"Oh, I have no idea where we are." Like I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
All I say are I do things like this. You got to show your work, bud.
Oh,
Like I don't
that's
like
great. And then
let
they
me in.
know that's what you're
Mhm.
asking. Okay, okay, cool.
Like, huh? Or I'll
Mhm,
be
mhm.
like, "Introductory sentence, please." Like, "Hello," like,
Gotcha.
great, but obviously we have a relationship to where I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
do stuff like that. If I don't
yeah,
know them well enough, I'll just be like, "I don't have a context for what you're saying."
yeah,
Like, I
right.
need the context for what you're saying so I can, and I desperately want to understand it. Like,
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
desperately want to understand what you're trying to communicate with me because clearly
That's
it's
right.
it's important to you. So I want to
Right,
understand it.
right. Yep.
But it's just funny. So like I'll say something like, "Okay, show your work." But a lot of times, like Dana, do you feel like this is also related to communication differences too? Like
Oh, yeah,
that
yeah,
is so that is a big thing I think in autistics,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Communication style, communication challenges, communication
Mhm.
like this also plays a role in sharing what's in that brilliant minds of
Right. Yeah.
theirs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how do
Yeah.
you do that? But I love
Yeah, how
this.
do
I
you tolerate it? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's funny to me too because how often as you're thinking, and I know like we've put me, what did we're calling me a NOS? Are we calling me a NOS? An
Yeah, then not
NOS,
otherwise specified. Yeah.
the not otherwise specified person. As you're talking about this, there are immediately multiple examples that I can come up with
Mm.
in my life,
Mhm.
right?
Oh,
Where I'm like, wow, that really made sense to me.
please pray tell one instance, if you wouldn't mind. I'd love to hear
S- So, okay, this might actually be more inattentional blindness
it. Okay.
as I think about things.
Oh,
But
okay. Okay.
as you're talking about the Starbucks example, there are so many. Okay, I'm sure I could come up with an example where I'm like, that totally made sense to me, but
Yeah.
I made a really weird social decision. Okay, so I'll get
Oh.
so I'll give you one example.
Mhm.
Where I used to work out before I was displaced by the fires.
Mhm.
Um, I had worked out there for a long time, took a break, and then went
Mhm.
back. And on my first
Mhm.
time back, I was
Mhm.
super
Yeah.
nervous to go back. And the first part of the workout, they demonstrate all the things that are happening in the class.
Oh, okay. Like ahead of
So,
time.
right, before the class. And then, so everyone really is supposed to go to the edges.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
I was so in my mind and so focused on like what this person was doing. I was
Mhm.
sitting in the middle on a piece of equipment and the
Doing
and the
doing what
coach
they were doing. Yeah. Yeah.
like I just watching.
Oh, okay.
Everyone else was on the edges,
Oh
had
god.
no
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, yeah,
And the
yeah.
coach
Yeah.
comes up to me and was like, "Can you move?"
Oh.
Like, and I look around like, "Oh my god, this is so embarrassing."
This is
That's
the reason you
probably
don't go to the
this
gym
is
and why you were so
this is
nervous.
why
Yeah.
I don't go to the gym anymore.
Yeah.
There's so
Yeah.
many reasons why I don't go to the gym. No, I really actually need to go back.
Oh god.
There was an okay, so as you're talking about the Starbucks thing where I'm
Yeah.
like, I totally created a story
Yeah. Yeah,
where
yeah.
this
Yep. You're not just doing it
completely
out of the blue. You created a narrative of why it makes sense to be doing what you're doing.
but
Yeah.
I've had so many social interactions
Yeah.
where I clearly made the wrong decision
Mhm,
because
mhm.
of
What?
I can read social reactions. But I was just
Doesn't mean
like
you do
so
it
in my
every
head.
time. Yeah,
I was
yeah,
so in my head. I had made
yeah,
up a reason why that made sense to me. If
yeah,
I'm gonna well now you just wait. I'll come up now
yeah.
that my brain is primed there. I'll come up with more stories. But
I know, I do
I
it all the time, like watching sports. Those that are into NCAA, we watch the women's basketball, Californians, right? Juju Watkins hurt her knee yesterday, is gonna be out, has to have surgery. My mind, though, she had twisted her ankle 2 games prior. They showed that. I'm like, it has to be because she twisted her ankle, that she was walking tentatively on it, and that made her vulnerable to the knee thing. I'm explaining all this to my wife,
yeah.
and she's like, I don't know that. She's supposed to know it. She'll hear those sometimes as I'm like, don't you know this? And she's like, well, I don't know that. They didn't say anything about that. And I'm like, oh, sorry. That's where my mind goes to how did this happen to her now? Because she had already hurt her ankle. They probably shouldn't have had her play, blah, blah, blah. Now she's got the season ending, right? But she'll be like, it's too much, you know? And so but it doesn't happen every time. I'll do that with names that people have, or I'll try to understand why one player threw the ball to another player and my wife will explain it to me, but it doesn't make sense in my I made those connections thing. So then I'll come back and say, but wasn't it da da da? And if it isn't what actually happened, the other person can be defensive, understandably, because it's not how
Yeah.
it happened. But in your mind, you're like, that's how it could have happened. And so there are all these social faux pas, like like your guy saying, "Can you move?" And
Literally,
then
and
you're
it was
like, "Oh my god!" Right?
they were
Yeah.
already in the middle of the demonstration.
Oh
That's
my
how
god.
far
Yeah.
it got, Dana.
Yeah. 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 And I'll
'Cause
have this
I was just
happen
like
when, yeah,
absorbed.
I have this happen when I'm teaching, where me and other neurodivergent students, they'll say something, and I'm like right there with them. I've made
Yeah.
that zip wire moment,
Yeah.
And then someone might raise their hand and be like, I don't understand what you guys are talking about. And then I'll be like, sorry, let me rewind. I do this thing like when a dog slides on a
Oh yeah.
floor too far, they do this thing like it's going to stop them. And I go, oh, let me rewind. Go back to where I was, and then, fill other people in because they're not going to be privy to all that. But because their mind isn't filling in all those gaps, or just going in a direction that isn't what everybody else has went in. Why would you have been sitting there if it hadn't made perfect sense to you? You're not going to go. But to the outsider, I'm thinking like kids. They're like, "What's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? Why aren't you paying attention to what you're doing?" And they are. They just have a different set of instructions in what they're doing, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is why I love the phrase "show your work."
Yes. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
how did you come to that? Like, how did you
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
here? Because I'm
Yeah.
like very curious about it.
Yeah.
But the other piece, and
But if
this
you don't
this
ask, you're not going to be
y-
privy to that whole
you
thing.
don't know.
Yeah.
Well, and then it
Yeah.
looks like okay, so the other
It looks like
n-
carelessness, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
they're like other kind of negative assumptions, right?
Hmm.
You're not paying attention. You're
Yeah.
not on task. You don't care to be on
Yeah.
task. You're
Mm.
just too distractible. I mean, like we could go on and on about all these things. Oh, you're just in your head. Oh, this is your rigidity. You can't think about
Yeah.
anything else. All of these things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think this is also why in our last episode, we were
Mhm.
talking about the partnership of anxiety to autism.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's because like I have really quickly made up a narrative about
Mhm.
this to make meaning,
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever that is, right?
Yep.
And I find like with many of my clients, there is a deep desperation to be good and to do good.
Yeah.
And so the anxiety to do those things becomes
Right.
so overwhelming that we then hit decision fatigue and then we do nothing. Like
Right.
that's kind of where I see this go, right? But
Yep.
this making meaning and how fast it happens and how it informs the decisions that you make.
Yeah.
For me, whenever I realize that I'm in a situation where I've done something socially like and it's not
Mhm.
anything big, but it's enough to like
Yeah.
paralyze me for,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
um I was always in my mind.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
I was
Yeah, it's not that,
always
yeah,
like
you were
in my
always in your
mind.
mind. I was always in my
Yeah, my
mind. I was
yeah,
always in my mind. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And to me again, that's what's the fun, if you will, about being a therapist, because you're looking for those things. You're asking people for that stuff, right?
yeah,
It's kind of like the way I approach doing assessments with folks. I tell them at the beginning, this may feel nonlinear to you. I'm doing that on purpose because I'm assessing you as a neurodivergent to see if you're neurodivergent. I am. And I don't want to stifle that. We'll have time to make sure for me to go back and make sure I got all the data points I need. But so many people have had so much gaslighting and so much trauma from people saying, no, we need to stay on task. And it's like, let me do that. Let's go to these association pieces because that's where all the really good stuff is. And
yeah,
then we can look at our list afterwards and make sure we've touched on all those things. But there's so much messaging they get about all that tangential, which isn't really tangential thinking or filling in the gaps, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
also like I'm thinking of other people historically that have been hypothesized to be neurodivergent, like Einstein, for example, Oppenheimer. Did those thoughts that they created that were genius come out of a mind that was continually making connections that no one else had made before? I mean, that makes sense to me. You can see why people hypothesize that that's how their brains work.
yeah.
Don't know how to brush their teeth every morning, had to have his wife tell him to do it. But, there has to be space for all that popcorn thinking. You can't remember to do basic tasks necessarily, right?
Well, they're not interesting. I mean, in the sense that
Yeah,
they're not like they don't. If you have a difficult time with like that's like classically executive functioning in my
right.
mind,
Yeah.
which a lot of times I think executive functioning gets the label of like goal setting, planning, and
Hmm.
executing
Hmm.
tasks,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
really we need to get more sensory motor, I think, with executive functioning. And I've
I
like,
agree. Yeah.
Deb Budding is like she's like an expert in the field. And I have like the luxury of being a colleague of hers. And we talk about this a
Mm,
lot
hmm.
in
Yeah,
regards to sensory motor function and
yeah,
how important sensory motor functioning is in executive functioning.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but the idea like I have to work really hard to bring mundane things into my attentional space.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
That's
why.
right.
That's
Yep.
why you have the I didn't eat, I didn't brush my teeth. It's
Mhm.
all the stuff that
Mhm.
you're like, you can't even do that, but you can do all these
Yeah.
other things.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Yeah.
um, but the idea of making meaning and how that can really lead to I'm gonna come up with more. Watch, we're
Some
gonna
interesting looks. Yeah.
come
Yeah.
off of this episode and I'm going to have the funniest stories that pop up to my mind. I will capture them, and now that my intentional, like,
And then we'll
focus is
report
there,
back later. Yeah. Yeah.
I will
Oh
totally
god.
report back
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I can tell you, like, I've had this happen to me
Yeah.
over and over and over again
Yeah.
where I'm like, "How did I make
And
that
and the shame is so
decisions?"
big
The
that I
shame
feel
is
like
so big.
I need to come clean. The the coffee cup story wasn't a client's, it was mine. I did it. I was sitting here and I'm like, I don't know why I made pretended that was a client. Why did I do that? I'm like, oh, because of the shame. It's the shame. It's
It's
so
the sh
big. So big.
it's
Yeah.
so big, and it's like, it doesn't have to be, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah.
The reality is probably, Dana, no one probably remembers about you grabbing Dan's coffee,
No, and in fact, I was
and
so aware
yeah,
when Dan said, "I think that's my coffee." I hadn't drank it or anything. I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," knowing that I had this whole thing, and I'm like, "He does
uh
not need
no,
my whole thing." I just said, "I'm so sorry," and then I went back in, and
yeah.
yeah,
No, no one's gonna remember that I
right, exactly,
was sitting
exactly,
literally on the
yeah,
exercise equipment while
yeah,
everyone else is on the
yeah.
edges.
But that's that resiliency thing you sort of have to deal with in therapy to have the therapist say, "It's okay. No one remembers. No one died. Babies weren't murdered. It's okay." And
Is
then
that
you can do that self talk later, be like, "Oh, okay, I'm all
yeah.
right. It's fine. I grabbed the wrong coffee. It's not a big deal."
By the
Yeah.
way, that's Dana's threshold. Murders
Babies
didn't
being
happen,
murdered.
babies being murdered.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
threshold. That's a good threshold, Dana.
Yeah. I learned that from someone else I used to work with, who was an admin for many, many years. So that
Yeah.
was her thing. When people come to her with emergencies, she'd be like, "Our baby's dying. Okay, if not, we have time to figure this out." Like, yeah, it's a good threshold. I like
It's a
that
good
one.
threshold.
Mhm.
Okay.
Because we seem to be kind of crossing it as a country right now. We're getting
Oh, no,
close.
Dana, why you gotta go
Yeah.
there?
Oh, sorry, I
You
had
wanna
to
that's
talk
like
about
what?
associations. Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
well, I mean, honestly, I mean, I'll be clear that I'm absolutely terrified, but,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that's where I
And you
am, and
want to
I
know
have
the
to resist that.
association where that one is? Ron DeSantis introduced a bill to let 13 to 14-year olds do migrant picking in the fields because they don't have enough people now because they keep deporting everybody. So he thinks a good solution is to let a 14-year-old do an overnight shift in an orange grove picking oranges. So when I said, yeah, our baby's dying, well, it's we're pushing the limits of that. But yeah, we don't want to get too political. But that was an association I had. So that's some of where my mind went with that. I was like, oh, we're
Yeah.
getting close.
Let
So
me
there can be that piece too, where you're privy to details that other people might not be because your mind is filling in those gaps. You're like, oh, we're gonna get there. Hence the
and
anxiety, right?
hence the anxiety, and I'll be honest with, I think, the with our friends, with our audience.
Hmm.
Dana and I censor a lot of our stuff.
Oh yeah.
We are not as
Yeah.
loose as we
Yeah.
joked around to be, because
Hmm.
Dana and I will have our looser associations off
Hmm.
the record button.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
But we just really care about people's well-being and that, we want that to be okay. So there's a lot going on right now that are
yeah.
threatening that. So
I
regardless
am
of your
traveling.
ideation, it's scary. Yeah.
Yeah, I am traveling, or your ideology, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Regardless of your ideology.
Right.
Um, hey Dana, I am traveling, so our friends, if I get deported, we
Yeah.
might have a little hiccup.
Yeah. To Canada. Yeah. Don't leave the country. You're going to the East Coast, probably be okay, but don't
We'll
leave the
probably be
country.
okay. This summer I am leaving the country, so we'll see if I get back
Ooh.
in. We'll
Oof.
see. We'll see
Okay.
what happens.
Scary
But I
stuff.
figured, like, me being deported back to Canada isn't such a bad thing.
Can you take me with you? Will you adopt me? Please. Please. All right, that's good. That's some good association to
Okay,
be
bye
ending
everybody.
on. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh
okay.
God. Oh God.
All we can do is laugh at this point.
Yeah.
Laugh and have little acts of rebellion.
Yeah.
We can talk.
That is
We
a
should talk
thought
about
I've
little
thought
acts
of.
of
I'm like,
rebellion.
can Gwen adopt us? Is that a
Yeah,
thing? Yeah.
100%. We'll buy a big piece of land.
Yeah.
We'll
We'll all
create a
live on there.
compound.
Totally. Yep.
Can you
Tiny. Can we
imagine?
do the tiny house compound? Be awesome.
How
Yeah.
fun would that? Anyone else? Anyone else want to just
Oh,
pitch
I'm sure
in?
we'd have a lot of takers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we would
Yeah.
have. We'll create our own place. Anyway, all right.
Exactly.
Be good. Be good
All right.
seeing
Have good
everyone.
travels to Boston.
Thanks.
Boston can be a little dicey with racism too. So be careful.
Thanks. All right. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.